A single mom stood up for a quiet waiter when no one else would. Just a stranger being decent, nothing more. What she didn't know, that waiter was the most powerful mafia boss in the city. And her one act of kindness just made her the most protected woman in Chicago. The grilled cheese was cold. Emily Carter stared at it anyway, too tired to care. 11 hours on her feet, 3 tables that stiffed her on tips, and a broken register at the end of her shift had drained whatever energy she'd been running on. Now she sat in a corner booth at Ronnie's Diner, the only place still open past midnight on this side of Chicago, watching her 8-year-old son Noah draw racing cars on a paper napkin like the world was a perfectly simple place. She envied him for that. "Can I get chocolate milk?" he asked without looking up. "You already had juice." "Juice doesn't count." "It absolutely counts." Noah finally looked up, squinting at her with the specific negotiating expression she recognized as her own. She almost smiled. Almost. "Fine," she said. "1 chocolate milk." He went back to his napkin, victorious and unbothered. The diner was nearly empty, a trucker nursing coffee near the door, an old woman reading a paperback 2 booths down, and behind the counter, a waiter who moved with the quiet efficiency of someone used to being invisible. Emily had noticed him when they walked in. Tall, dark-haired, somewhere in his mid-30s. He hadn't smiled the way waiters usually performed smiles. He'd simply nodded and handed her a menu, and something about that, the absence of performance, made her remember him. His name tag said Daniel. He brought Noah's chocolate milk without being asked. Noah looked up like a small king receiving tribute. "Thank you." "You're welcome," Daniel said, and his voice was low and unhurried, the kind that didn't reach beyond the table it was meant for. Emily watched him for half a second longer than necessary, then looked away. The trouble arrived at 12:34 a.m. She knew, because she'd just checked her phone to calculate how quickly she could get Noah home and into bed. 3 men. Loud before they even opened the door. The kind of drunk that isn't fun for anyone, except the people who are doing it. They took the stools at the counter like they owned them, ordered food in voices that filled every corner of the diner, and began the specific performance of men who want to be noticed. Daniel served them without a word. At first, Emily barely paid attention. She'd seen drunk men in diners before. It usually passed. But then, one of them, heavy-set, wearing a leather jacket with a grease stain on the shoulder, grabbed Daniel's wrist when he set down the ketchup bottle. "Hey." The man's voice dropped, low and deliberate. "I asked for something else." Daniel looked at the hand on his wrist. He didn't pull away. He didn't flinch. He simply stood there, completely still, and said, "I'll get that for you." Something in his stillness made the man squeeze harder. "You look familiar," the man said, leaning in now. His 2 friends had stopped talking and were watching. "You should be more careful where you work." Emily's fork stopped moving. She looked at Noah, who was still drawing, headphones from her phone now plugged into his ears. "Good." She looked back at the counter. The trucker near the door had suddenly found his coffee very interesting. The old woman hadn't turned a page in a while. Nobody was going to do anything. She knew that feeling. She'd grown up with it. The room going quiet while something bad got ready to happen, and everyone deciding at the same moment that it was someone else's problem. The man shoved Daniel, not hard enough to send him into the wall, just hard enough to make a point. Emily was out of her booth before she decided to move. "Hey." Her voice came out louder than she intended, sharp enough that all 3 men turned. She stood in the middle of the diner, still holding her fork, aware of how ridiculous she probably looked in her waitress uniform with a grease stain on her own collar. "That's enough." Leather Jacket looked at her like she'd appeared out of thin air. "Excuse me." "You heard me." She kept her voice even. "He brought you what you ordered. Keep your hands to yourself." A slow smile crossed the man's face, the kind that meant she'd made herself a problem. "Lady," he said, "you have absolutely no idea what you just walked into." "Neither do you," she said. "But I'm guessing nobody else in this room is going to call the police, so I just did." She hadn't. Her phone was still on the table, but the man didn't know that. A long moment passed, the kind that stretches like a wire pulled too tight. Then the man stood, adjusted his jacket, and jerked his head at his friends. They moved toward the door, but he paused at Emily's booth, where Noah sat, still drawing, still oblivious, and let his eyes rest there just a moment too long. He looked back at Daniel. "We'll be seeing you again," he said quietly. "Real soon." The door swung shut behind them. The diner exhaled. Emily turned around. Daniel was standing exactly where she'd left him, still, composed, hands at his sides, watching the door with an expression that wasn't fear, wasn't relief, wasn't even surprise. It was the expression of a man who had already begun calculating his next move. She just didn't know that yet. Emily almost didn't go back. She told herself it was convenience. Ronnie's diner was 3 blocks from the elementary school where she dropped Noah every morning, and their coffee was the only kind on this side of the neighborhood that didn't taste like it had been brewed during the previous administration. It had nothing to do with the man behind the counter, or the way he'd stood so still while someone shoved him, or the strange, unsettled feeling she'd carried home like a stone in her shoe. It was just coffee. She pushed through the door at 7:42 a.m., Noah's backpack drop-off still warm on her hands, 20 minutes before her own shift at the cafe 2 streets over. The morning crowd was thin. A few construction workers, a woman in scrubs staring blankly at her phone, the same old woman from last night now on what appeared to be a different paperback. Daniel was behind the counter. He saw her the moment she walked in, not in the way people glance at a door, in the way someone who has been expecting a specific person finally sees them arrive. It lasted less than a second, and then it was replaced with something neutral and polite, and Emily almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. "Corner booth?" he asked. "Counter's fine," she said. "I'm not staying long." She settled onto a stool and wrapped both hands around the mug he set in front of her before she'd even asked. The coffee was hot and strong and exactly what she needed, and for a moment she just sat with it, letting the morning be quiet. "I want to thank you," Daniel said. He was wiping down the counter, not looking at her, the motion slow and methodical. "For last night, what you didn't have to do that." "I know," Emily said. "Most people don't get involved." "I noticed." She took a sip. "They were going to hurt you. Maybe." He folded the cloth neatly, set it aside, and then looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes were dark brown, steady, the kind that had learned not to give things away. Or maybe they were just drunk and loud. Emily tilted her head. "You don't believe that." Something shifted in his expression. Just slightly. Just enough. "No," he said. "I don't." She waited for him to continue. He didn't. Instead, he refilled her mug, even though it was still more than half full, and said, "Do you come in every morning?" It was a casual question. The tone was warm, conversational, but something about the timing of it, right after the admission, right before she could ask a follow-up, made her pause. "Usually," she said, "depends on my shift." "Where do you work?" "Blue Elm Cafe, on Weston." He nodded like he was filing it away rather than simply hearing it. "That's a decent walk from here." "I take the 8:15 bus." She watched him. "Why?" "Just making sure you're not going out of your way." He smiled, and it was a good smile. genuine enough that she almost relaxed. "I'd feel bad if you were. I'd feel worse if I hadn't said anything last night, and those men had—" She stopped, looked down at her mug. My son was right there. "Noah," Daniel said. Emily looked up. "You called his name," Daniel said quietly before she could react, "when you came back to the booth to check on him. I heard you." She studied him for a moment. "You notice a lot. Occupational habit." He moved to the other end of the counter to refill a construction worker's coffee, easy and unhurried, and the conversation seemed to simply pause itself. Not end, just wait. Emily finished her coffee. She left a 5 on the counter, more than the coffee cost. She told herself it was because of the good service. She was almost at the door when Daniel said, behind her, "Be careful on your way to the bus stop, Emily." She turned around. He was already facing the kitchen, scribbling something on an order pad. She stepped outside into the pale morning light. The black sedan was parked across the street. Emily noticed it the way you notice something that doesn't belong, not with alarm exactly, more with the small internal flag that says that's new. It was angled just slightly toward the diner's entrance, engine off, windows tinted enough that she couldn't see inside clearly. She told herself it was nothing. Street parking, someone waiting for someone. She caught the 8:15 bus, found a window seat, and watched the diner disappear behind her as the bus pulled away. Inside the diner, Daniel refilled the last of the morning coffees, collected 2 checks, and smiled at the woman in scrubs when she finally looked up from her phone. Then he walked calmly to the back hallway, past the restrooms, past the office where Ronnie kept his accounting in paper folders like it was still 1987, and out through the emergency exit into the narrow alley behind the building. He stood in the cold morning air for exactly 4 seconds. Then he took out his phone, not the one he kept in his front pocket, the ordinary one, the one with the cracked screen protector and 3 contacts saved, but a second phone, slim and matte black, from his inside jacket pocket. He typed a single message. Sedan. Plates. IL7-WOLF-4. Confirm ID. The reply came in 11 seconds. Vega crew. Low-level scout. Tracking you since Tuesday. Daniel read it twice. Then he looked back toward the alley entrance, toward the direction of the street where the sedan was parked, where the scout was still sitting in his car, watching a diner door and thinking he was invisible. He thought about Emily, about the way she'd walked out into the morning without hesitation, about Noah's name, about the 8:15 bus on Weston and the Blue Elm Cafe, and all the small coordinates of an ordinary life she'd handed him without realizing it. Not because she was careless, but because she had no idea there was a reason to be careful. She'd stepped in front of danger for him without knowing what danger actually looked like. That was the problem. He typed a second message. Keep the scout visible. Don't move on him yet. I need to know who he's reporting to. Then he put the phone back in his pocket, smoothed down his jacket, and walked back through the emergency exit into the hallway, past the accounting folders, past the restrooms, and back behind the counter where the morning rush was just beginning to thin. A couple near the window flagged him down for the check. He brought it with a smile. Nobody in the diner would have guessed that in the span of 90 seconds, the quiet waiter had just decided to dismantle the entire surveillance network closing in around him, and had also started quietly, carefully, building a wall around a woman who didn't even know she was standing in the middle of a war. He poured himself a small cup of coffee and drank it standing at the counter, watching the street through the glass. The sedan didn't move. Neither did he. Emily had a rule about worrying. She allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of it per day. Usually on the bus ride home when Noah was at after-school care and there was nothing to perform for, no one to reassure. 5 minutes to let the anxiety surface, turn it over, examine the worst-case version of whatever was bothering her, and then put it down. It was the only system that had kept her functional as a single mother working 2 jobs in a city that didn't particularly care whether she kept up. Tonight, the 5 minutes ran out too fast. She sat on the 6:20 bus home, bag on her lap, watching the city lights smear past the window, and the unease she'd been managing since morning refused to behave. It kept circling back to Daniel, his composed face, the second phone she hadn't seen but somehow sensed, the casual way he'd said be careful, like it was a warning dressed up as politeness. They were going to hurt you. Maybe. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and told herself to stop. The car was still there when she got home. Not the same black sedan from this morning. That one had been clean, deliberate, almost corporate in the way it sat. This was a gray hatchback with a dent along the rear panel, idling at the far end of the apartment lot with its lights off. Exhaust curled from the tailpipe in the cold evening air, which meant the engine was running, which meant someone was sitting in it, which meant they weren't just parked. Emily walked quickly to the entrance, Noah's hand in hers. "Mom, you're walking fast." "I know, baby. Keep up." She badged them through the lobby door without looking back. In the elevator, she checked her phone out of habit. 2 missed calls from her mother, a reminder about Noah's school photos on Thursday. Nothing alarming. She exhaled slowly through her nose. Old car. Someone waiting for a friend. Stop it. But at her floor, before she could get the key in the lock, her neighbor's door swung open. Zakharov. Petrov was 71, originally from Odessa, and had the specific nosiness of someone who had survived enough history to justify it. She appeared in her doorway, holding a dish towel, eyes sharp and alert, and spoke before Emily could say hello. 2 men came today, she said. While you were at work, they knocked on your door, then they knocked on mine. Emily's hand stilled on the key. What did they want? They asked about you. What time you come home, whether you live alone? Mrs. Petrov's expression was not frightened. It was the face of a woman who had seen worse and catalogued it for future reference. I told them I didn't know you, which was a lie, obviously, but they didn't look like people who needed to know your business. What did they look like? Big, unfriendly, one had a leather jacket. She paused, the kind with a stain on the shoulder. The cold moved through Emily from the inside out. She thanked Mrs. Petrov, got Noah through the door, locked both the deadbolt and the chain, and stood in her own hallway for a moment with her back against the door and her heartbeat loud in her ears. Noah dropped his backpack on the kitchen floor, opened the fridge with the confidence of someone who lived there, and said, "Can I have the leftover pasta?" "Yes," Emily said. "Warm it up, please. 2 minutes." She went to the window in her bedroom, the one that faced the parking lot, and looked down. The gray hatchback was still there. Daniel sat in his own car 3 blocks away and read the update on his matte black phone. 2 Vega scouts made contact at the woman's residence, knocked on neighboring units. Building super also approached, offered cash for her schedule. He read it once, read it again. Then he called a number that rang exactly twice before being answered with silence. "They've moved to her building," Daniel said. "I need eyes on the lot at Carver and 9th. Quiet eyes. No contact, no intervention unless it becomes physical." A pause, then a low voice. "That's a lot of coverage for a civilian. She's not the target. She's the exposure." He let a beat pass. "And she has a kid." Another pause, shorter this time. Done. He put the phone down and stared through the windshield at the street. Around him, Chicago moved the way it always did at night. Cabs and delivery trucks and the ordinary machinery of a city that never fully slept. Indifferent to the small war being conducted inside its edges. The Vega Syndicate. He'd known they would find him eventually. He hadn't been careless exactly, but running had its limits. A man could only hollow himself out so completely before something recognizable stayed behind. A habit, a posture, the way he stood too still in a crisis. They'd been looking for 6 months, ever since the betrayal inside his own organization had forced him to disappear. And they'd been getting closer. He hadn't expected them to find her first. At 11:15 p.m., the gray hatchback finally moved. It pulled slowly out of the Carver Street lot and turned north. Daniel's contact followed it at a distance, tracking it through 4 turns and a highway on-ramp before it pulled into the parking structure of a mid-range hotel in Wicker Park. The driver got out. Daniel's contact sent a photo. Daniel looked at it for a long moment. Marco Setti, junior courier for the Vega network, unremarkable enough to be used as a scout, the kind of man no one looked at twice, which was precisely why he was dangerous. He'd been feeding Emily's routine, her schedule, her building layout, her son's school schedule, back to someone higher up the chain. Daniel typed, "Room number 314. He sat with that for a moment, then he started the car. He didn't enjoy this part. That was something people always assumed incorrectly. That men like him felt nothing, or worse, felt something dark and satisfying when they peeled back the ordinary surface of the world and did what needed doing underneath it. The truth was more complicated. There was simply a calculation that had to be made and a line that, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. Marco Setti had found a woman and her child. He had stood at her neighbor's door and asked for her schedule. He had sat outside her building for 3 hours, watching her window. The calculation wasn't complicated. Daniel checked into the same hotel under a name that didn't exist, took the stairs to the 3rd floor, and did what he'd been avoiding for 6 months. He handled it. By midnight, the threat to Emily's building was gone. By 12:30, his contact had confirmed the information pipeline to the Vega crew had been severed. By 1 a.m., Daniel was back in his car, driving through the quiet streets, and the city looked exactly the same as it always did. Lights, movement, indifference. Emily didn't know any of it. She was asleep by then. Noah tucked in beside her because he'd had a nightmare, and she hadn't had the energy to argue. One lamp still burning on the nightstand. Her door double-locked against a danger she could feel but not name. Outside in the lot below her window, a black SUV sat quietly in the dark, watching over her. 2 days passed without incident. Emily almost believed it was over. She changed her bus route anyway, took the longer way to work, the one that added 11 minutes and required a transfer, and told herself it was because she wanted to stop at the pharmacy on Clement Street. She started sitting closer to the driver on public transport. She called Noah's school and asked them, casually, to make sure he didn't leave the front entrance without a staff member present. Small adjustments, the kind that didn't require explaining to anyone, least of all herself. She didn't go back to Ronnie's diner. The extra shift came up Thursday morning, a last-minute call from a downtown cafe called The Meridian. Upscale, tourist-adjacent, the kind of place that charged $9 for a cortado and expected you to act like that was reasonable. A girl on their regular staff had called in sick. The manager had Emily's number from a failed application 2 years ago. It was $40 more than her usual rate, plus tips from a lunch crowd that actually tipped. She said yes before he finished asking. The Meridian was on Michigan Avenue, 12 blocks from her neighborhood in a different world entirely. Exposed brick walls, Edison bulbs, a chalkboard menu written in handwriting too pretty to be natural. Emily tied her apron and got to work, and for 3 hours the only things that existed were coffee orders and dessert specials and the clean, manageable rhythm of a busy service. She was clearing a two-top near the window at 1:15 p.m. when she felt it. That specific pressure of being watched. She straightened slowly, plates in hand, and scanned the room. Lunch crowd thinning. A businessman on a laptop. 2 women sharing a bottle of wine. Near the entrance, taking a table without waiting to be seated. 3 men. Her stomach dropped. Not all the same ones from the diner, only 2 were familiar. Leather Jacket wasn't among them, but the one who'd sat silently watching that night, the one with the pale, flat eyes and the patience of something cold-blooded, was there. He was looking directly at her. He'd been looking at her before she'd even noticed him, she realized. He'd come in already knowing where she was standing. She set the plates down at the busing station, told herself to walk to the back and call someone, the police, anyone, and was halfway through that plan when the 3rd man materialized at her elbow from nowhere. "Emily Carter," he said. "Not a question." She turned. Close up, he was younger than she'd expected. Mid-20s, neat hair, wearing a jacket that was too expensive for someone doing this kind of errand. He smiled at her, the way people smile when they know you have nowhere to go. "You know my name," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "We know a lot of things." He tilted his head, still smiling. "We know you have a son at Carver Elementary. We know you take the 8:15 to Blue Elm on weekdays. We know you covered a shift here today." The blood drained from her face. "What do you want?" "The waiter," he said simply. "The man from the diner, his real name, where he's staying, how to find him. You tell us that, and you go back to your tables. You pick up your son at 3, and none of this ever touched you." Behind him, Flat Eyes was watching the room with quiet, clinical attention, cataloging exits, clocking the other customers, doing the mental work of someone who'd already planned 3 versions of how this could go. "I don't know where he is," Emily said. "I don't know him. I had coffee at that diner twice in my life." "Twice is enough." The young man leaned in slightly. "He talked to you. He warned you about something. And then 2 of our associates stopped reporting in." His voice dropped, the smile finally fading. "So you understand why we need to have this conversation?" "I genuinely have nothing to tell you." Her hands had started shaking, and she pressed them flat against her apron. "I'm a waitress. I stood up to some men in a diner because they were being aggressive. That's all." He studied her for a long moment. The smile came back, smaller and colder than before. "Let's sit down," he said, and put a hand on her arm. The hand never tightened, because from across the room someone said, "I wouldn't." The voice was quiet. It didn't carry any particular menace. No raised volume, no theatrical edge. It was simply a fact, delivered the way you'd state a weather forecast. Emily looked up. Daniel stood just inside the cafe entrance, still wearing the white shirt from the diner, jacket over it now, hands in his pockets. He looked completely unhurried, completely calm. He looked, she thought wildly, like a man who had arrived precisely when he intended to. The young man's hand dropped from her arm. Flat Eyes had gone very still, in a way that was different from his previous stillness. This was the stillness of an animal that had just identified something higher on the food chain. "Walk away from her," Daniel said. Not to the room, not loudly, directly, clearly to the 2 men, the way you speak to someone when you've already made the decision and you're offering them the chance to make theirs. The young man turned fully to face Daniel. A complicated sequence of emotions crossed his face in a short span of time. Surprise, calculation, something that tried to be defiance and fell slightly short. "You're not difficult to find," he said. "I know," Daniel replied. "That's because I let you find me." He finally removed his hands from his pockets, not in any threatening way, just a shift in posture, but both men's eyes tracked it like a reflex they couldn't control. "You're going to leave now. You're going to walk out that door, and you're going to tell whoever sent you that you found nothing useful, and the trail is cold. And if we don't?" Daniel looked at him for a moment, that stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. "Then you don't walk out," he said. the silence in that corner of the cafe lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then, the young man straightened his jacket, nodded once to Flat Eyes, and moved toward the door with the deliberate, careful gait of someone refusing to look like they're retreating while absolutely retreating. Flat Eyes followed. At the door, the young man glanced back, not at Emily, but at Daniel, and what was on his face wasn't anger. It was fear. Clean, genuine, unguarded fear, the kind you can't perform because it lives below the level of control. The door closed. Emily stood in the middle of the cafe with her apron strings twisted between her fingers and her heart knocking against her ribs, and turned to look at Daniel. He was already looking at her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "No," she said honestly. He nodded, like that was the right answer, like he'd expected nothing less from her. Around them, the cafe had already resumed its ordinary noise. Espresso machines, quiet conversation, the indifferent soundtrack of a city afternoon, as if nothing had happened at all. But Emily's hands didn't stop shaking for a long time after, and in her chest, underneath the fear, something else was taking shape. A question. One that, once she started asking it, she already knew wasn't going to have a simple answer. "Who are you?" She didn't ask him that day. Partly because the cafe manager appeared from the back the moment the men left, flustered and apologetic, asking if everything was okay, offering her the rest of the afternoon off with pay. Partly because 2 of the other waitstaff had drifted close enough to hear anything she said. And partly, if she was being completely honest, because she wasn't sure she was ready for whatever the answer was going to be. Daniel walked her to the bus stop. He didn't ask permission. He simply fell into step beside her when she left the cafe. And she let him, and they walked half a block in silence before she said, "How did you know I was there?" "I heard you'd picked up a shift downtown." "From who?" He paused just barely, the kind of pause that wouldn't register to most people, just a fraction of a second, a breath held and released. The diner owner knows people. Word gets around. It was a perfectly reasonable answer. It was also, she sensed, not entirely the truth. "Those men knew my son's school," she said. "His schedule, they knew my bus route." "I know. That's not a small thing, Daniel." "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." "So, are you going to tell me what's going on?" They reached the bus stop. He stood with his back to the street, facing her, hands back in his jacket pockets. The afternoon light was flat and gray, the kind Chicago wore like a default setting in November. "Not yet," he said. She stared at him. "Not yet." "When I can, I will. I promise you that." The bus arrived before she could respond. She got on. She didn't look back through the window to see if he watched it go, but when she reached her stop and stepped off, something made her glance down the street anyway. He wasn't there. Of course he wasn't. She walked home with her hands in her pockets, and her mind turning over everything she'd seen in the last 4 days, arranging the pieces the way you arrange furniture in an unfamiliar room, trying to find a configuration that made sense. She started paying attention differently. It wasn't surveillance exactly. She didn't follow him or write things down. She simply stopped filtering out the details she'd been unconsciously setting aside, the ones her tired brain had been too overloaded to examine closely. The watch, for instance. She noticed it the next morning when she finally went back to Ronnie's, not because she decided to, she told herself, but because it was on her way and her coffee maker had broken, and that was simply that. Daniel was restocking the condiment station when she came in, and when he reached across the counter to hand her a menu, his sleeve rode up slightly. The watch was dark-faced, slim, and sitting against his wrist, with the quiet confidence of something that cost more than she made in a month. Not flashy. Precisely the opposite. It was the kind of expensive that didn't announce itself, that assumed you already knew. She filed it away. the calls were harder to miss. Twice during her 40-minute visit, his phone vibrated against the counter where he'd set it face down near the register. He glanced at the screen both times, and both times his expression did something small and controlled. A decision being made, a door being closed, before he silenced it and returned to whatever he was doing. He didn't answer. He didn't look worried about not answering. He looked like a man who had decided the call could wait because he had already handled whatever it was about. On the second one, she caught a glimpse of the screen before he flipped it over. No contact name. Just a number, long, international format, too many digits for domestic. She drank her coffee. She thought about the second phone in his inside jacket pocket that she'd never actually seen, but felt certain existed. She thought about the way he'd walked into the Meridian the previous afternoon. Not rushed, not reactive, not the way anyone arrived somewhere by coincidence, and said I wouldn't with the flat authority of someone who had spent years making decisions that other people felt in their bodies. "You're staring," Daniel said, refilling her mug. "I'm thinking," she corrected. "About what?" She looked at him directly. "About whether you're actually a waiter." Something moved across his face. Not guilt. Something more controlled than guilt. An acknowledgement, maybe. The look of a man who had been waiting for a particular door to open and was now deciding how wide to let it swing. "I'm working here," he said carefully. "That's not what I asked." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he picked up a cloth and moved to the other end of the counter, and the conversation was over. Not rudely, just efficiently, the way you close a window before the weather changes. Emily left a few minutes later. She told herself to let it go. She was on her way home from the pharmacy that evening, taking the shortcut through the Halsted Street parking garage, the covered one with the flickering light on level 2 that maintenance had been promising to fix since August, when she heard voices below her. She stopped on the stairwell landing. 2 floors down, between 2 parked cars, Daniel stood facing a man she'd never seen, mid-40s, stocky, wearing a delivery uniform with the logo of a restaurant supply company on the chest. The man had both hands raised slightly, palms out, the universal posture of someone trying very hard to communicate that they were not a threat. He was talking fast, low, urgent, and terrified. She couldn't make out the full words. The garage ate sound strangely, bouncing some things and swallowing others. But she caught fragments. "Didn't know it was you? Never would have. I swear. Just tell me what you need. I'll do whatever." Daniel said something quiet. The man's shoulders collapsed inward, like a building losing its structural support. He nodded rapidly, head down, and then 2 men Emily hadn't even noticed stepped from the shadows on either side of him, large, silent, patient, and walked him toward a gray van parked at the far end of the level. He went without a word of protest. Daniel watched until the van doors closed. Then he straightened his jacket, turned, and looked up at the stairwell, directly at her. Emily's hand gripped the railing. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The flickering light on level 2 buzzed and stuttered between them, and in its unsteady light, Daniel looked different from the man behind the diner counter. Same face, same stillness, but the context had fallen away entirely, and what was underneath it was something that didn't belong in a waiter's uniform. He didn't look angry that she'd seen it. He didn't look surprised. He looked, she thought, almost relieved, like a man who had been holding his breath for a very long time and had just, involuntarily, exhaled. "Emily," he said. "Don't," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Don't explain it right now. I need to—" She exhaled sharply. "I need a minute." He nodded. He didn't follow her as she turned and walked quickly up the stairwell and out into the cold evening air. But she knew, with the absolute certainty of someone who has just seen the thing behind the curtain, that there was no version of the next conversation that ended simply. Whatever Daniel Reed was, and he was not a waiter, she understood that now, with her whole body, not just her mind. She was already inside it. The question wasn't whether she was in danger. The question was how deep. The word coincidence only works a certain number of times. After that, it stops being a comfort and starts being a lie you're telling yourself because the truth requires action you're not ready to take. Emily had always been practical. Single motherhood had burned the luxury of denial out of her early, but even she had a threshold, and by the end of that week, she had crossed it. It started with the cafe. Friday morning, Blue Elm's manager called her before her shift started. His voice had the tight, careful quality of someone delivering bad news they'd been rehearsing. "We had a break-in last night," he said. "Back window. They didn't take much. Register was emptied, couple of laptops, but they made a mess of the place. Health inspector's coming, insurance wants photos. We're going to be closed at least through the weekend." "I'm sorry," Emily said. "That's awful." "Yeah." A pause. "Thing is, Em, it's the second time in 6 months. Insurance is going to make things difficult." Another pause, heavier. "I might have to cut back on hours for a while." She told him she understood. She hung up and sat on the edge of her bed in her uniform she hadn't yet had reason to take off, and stared at the wall. It was probably unrelated. It was probably just a bad week. She almost believed it. The call from Carver Elementary came at 2:47 p.m. She was folding laundry in the bedroom when the school's number appeared on her screen, and the specific cold fear that lives permanently in the back of every parent's mind surged forward before she'd even answered. "Mrs. Carter, this is Principal Howell. Noah is fine." Always that sentence first, she'd noticed, the way schools had been trained to lead with it. "But I wanted to let you know about an incident during dismissal today." She set down the shirt in her hands. "What happened?" "One of our staff members noticed a man on the sidewalk outside the east gate during pickup. He wasn't enrolled in our system as a guardian for any student, but he appeared to be following Noah specifically for about half a block before our aide intervened." Emily's hand tightened around the phone. "Can you describe him?" "Our aide said he was heavyset, dark jacket." Principal Howell's voice was careful, measured. "We've filed a report with the district. We'd also recommend filing one with the police, just as a precaution. Noah is safe. He's in the after-school room right now." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Emily said. She was there in 12. Noah was fine. He was sitting at a table with 2 other kids, working on what appeared to be a drawing of a dinosaur fighting a spaceship. And he looked up when Emily came in with the specific expression of someone who doesn't understand why adults are behaving strangely. "You're early," he said. "I missed you." She hugged him tighter than usual, and he tolerated it with the stoic dignity of an 8-year-old in front of witnesses. On the walk home, she held his hand and kept her eyes moving across both sides of the street. Doorways, parked cars, anyone standing still for no particular reason. And told herself she was being paranoid, and knew she wasn't. That night, she checked the locks 3 times. The landlord knocked on her door Saturday morning. Mr. Caruso was a compact, leather-skinned man in his 60s who had owned the building on Carver Street for decades and who communicated primarily through notes slipped under doors and occasional appearances in the lobby that he clearly found inconvenient. He had never, in the 2 years Emily had lived here, knocked on her door personally. He stood in the hallway, looking somewhere slightly to the left of her face, with the expression of a man who had been made to do something he found distasteful. "I need to talk to you about the unit," he said. "Okay," she said slowly. "I'm going to be renovating, starting soon. I'll need the unit vacant." He produced a folded envelope and held it out. "That's 2 months' notice, which is more than required. There's compensation inside to help with relocation. Emily stared at him. Mr. Caruso, I have a lease through April. The compensation covers the lease break. His eyes finally met hers, briefly and uncomfortably. I'm sorry, Emily. It's just business. She took the envelope because her hands moved before her mind caught up. Did someone ask you to do this? He was already turning away. 2 months. I'm sorry. He was back inside his own unit before she could say another word. She looked at the envelope in her hand. Inside was $1,500 in cash. Not a check, not a bank transfer. Cash in a plain white envelope, the way people paid for things they didn't want documented. She sat down on her kitchen floor, back against the cabinets, and let herself feel the full weight of it. Her job, destabilized. Her son, targeted. Her home, taken. In 1 week, systematically, precisely. This wasn't intimidation for its own sake. This was engineering. Someone clearing the board, applying pressure to every pillar of her ordinary life until she had nowhere stable to stand. No routine to hide inside. Nothing between her and whatever came next. And she knew, with the cold, quiet certainty she'd been assembling piece by piece all week, exactly whose fault it was. She called the diner. A woman answered. She hadn't known there was a woman, hadn't thought about the diner having anyone besides Ronnie and Daniel, and Emily asked for Daniel in a voice she kept deliberately flat. He's not on until tonight, the woman said. Tell him Emily called. Tell him... She stopped, chose the words carefully. Tell him I need him to stop. She hung up. What Emily didn't know was that the message arrived at a bad time. Daniel was in the back room of a warehouse in Pilsen, standing over a table covered in photographs and building schematics and a map of Chicago's South Side with certain locations circled in red. Around him, 4 men waited in the particular silence of people trained to be patient. He read the message his contact relayed to him. She says stop, and set his phone face down on the table. Talk to me, he said to the man on his left. The Vega crew is consolidating. 3 separate operations we'd disrupted have regrouped at a single location, warehouse district near the river. Either they're retreating or they're not retreating. Daniel studied the map. They're concentrating. Why concentrate unless you're preparing to move? The room was quiet. He'd been fighting this war on 2 fronts simultaneously, dismantling the Vega network piece by piece, while staying invisible enough that his own fractured organization couldn't locate him. Every move he made against the Vega crew slowed their reach toward Emily, but accelerated their aggression. He'd known from the beginning that this equilibrium couldn't hold indefinitely. He'd been hoping for more time. The boy was followed today, he said. Nobody responded because there was nothing to say to that. Double the coverage on the school and the apartment. He picked up his phone again, looked at Emily's message one more time. Tell him to stop. He understood what she meant. He also understood that stopping now was the one thing he absolutely could not do. He thought about her sitting on the bus 5 days ago, forehead against the cold glass, tired in the particular way of someone who never quite gets to rest. He thought about Noah drawing racing cars on a napkin. He put the phone in his pocket. Nobody sleeps, he said. We move tonight. 3 miles away, in her apartment on Carver Street, Emily stood at her bedroom window and watched the parking lot below. The black SUV was there again. 3rd night running, same spot, near the east entrance. She'd stopped pretending she hadn't noticed it. For a long time, she stood there in the dark, looking down at it, and it sat there in the dark, looking back up at her, and something passed between them that wasn't comfort exactly, but was adjacent to it. The awareness that something was standing between her and the dark, even if that something was itself a little dark around the edges. She pulled the curtain closed. She checked on Noah, asleep, one arm thrown over his dinosaur book, and stood in his doorway for a moment, listening to him breathe. Then she went back to the kitchen table and opened the white envelope again. $1,500 in cash. Someone was trying to move her like a chess piece. She stacked the bills neatly, put them back in the envelope, and put the envelope in her kitchen drawer. She wasn't moving. She shouldn't have gone out that night. She'd known it the moment she picked up her keys. That low, persistent hum at the base of her skull that she'd learned over the past week to treat as reliable intelligence rather than anxiety. But the refrigerator was empty in the specific way that becomes a problem when an 8-year-old wakes up hungry at 6 a.m. and the nearest grocery store was 4 blocks away. And she refused, absolutely refused, to let fear make her a prisoner in her own home. She left Noah with Mrs. Petrov, who had taken to watching him in the evenings with the grim protectiveness of someone who had decided Emily's situation was now her personal concern. She took her car, a 10-year-old Honda Civic that she kept running through sheer stubbornness, and a mechanic on Belmont who gave her honest prices, and drove to the grocery store. She was in and out in 18 minutes. She had milk, bread, eggs, the cereal Noah liked, and the particular satisfaction of someone who had done a small, ordinary thing despite everything trying to make ordinary things impossible. She turned onto Carver Street at 9:22 p.m. A black SUV pulled out of a side street and stopped directly in front of her. She hit the brakes hard enough that the grocery bags toppled in the back seat. Her headlights washed across the SUV's rear, dark, enormous, positioned deliberately across both lanes. And her mind ran the calculation instantly. Reverse, except there was already something behind her. She could see the headlights in her mirror, filling the space she'd just come from. Boxed in, her hands gripped the wheel. Her phone was in her jacket pocket. She was reaching for it when the doors of the black SUV opened. 4 men. She recognized 2 of them. Leather Jacket was there. The one from the diner, the original night, the one who'd shoved Daniel and let his eyes rest on Noah for too long. Beside him, Flat Eyes, moving with that same cold, cataloging patience she'd seen at the Meridian. The other 2 she'd never seen, but they were built and moving with purpose, and one of them had his hand inside his jacket in a way that made her stomach turn completely over. Leather Jacket walked to her driver's side window and knocked on it with 2 knuckles. Patient, like he had all night. She didn't open it. He knocked again. Emily. His voice was muffled through the glass, but clear enough. We're not here for you. Open the window, we talk for 5 minutes. You go home to your kid. That's all this has to be. She looked at her phone. Dialing 911 meant 4 minutes at minimum. She knew this neighborhood's response times from experience. A lot could happen in 4 minutes. Her window cracked open 2 inches. Where is he? Leather Jacket said. I don't know. You've been talking to him every other day for a week. I've had coffee at a diner. I don't know where he lives. I don't know his last name. I don't know anything about him that would help you. Leather Jacket studied her through the gap. You're not a very good liar. I'm not lying. Then you won't mind if we look through your phone. I mind very much, she said. I'm going to call the police right now. He put his hand flat against the window frame, casual, blocking it from opening further or closing. Behind him, the 2 men she didn't recognize had moved to the front of her car, and Flat Eyes was circling slowly to the passenger side, and the specific geometric progression of it, the way they were positioning themselves with practiced efficiency, eliminating options one by one, told her this wasn't improvised. This had been planned. She unlocked her phone with shaking hands. 3 things happened in the space of the next 4 seconds. Her driver's side window shattered, not from impact, from a specific shaped charge that took the glass out cleanly, the way people who know what they're doing remove windows. Something hit the rear SUV behind her. A collision, deliberate and hard, crumpling its front end and lurching it sideways far enough to open a gap in the blockade. And Daniel stepped out of the dark, between two parked cars with two men flanking him, and said, in the same quiet, weatherless voice he used for everything, "Get down." Emily dropped below the dashboard. What followed was 30 seconds of controlled violence. She heard it more than saw it, face pressed against the gear console, the sounds assembling into a sequence she couldn't fully process. Movement, impact, something heavy hitting pavement, a sharp crack she didn't want to identify, a voice saying something in a language she didn't recognize, then silence arriving all at once like a power cut. Then Daniel's hand was on her door, opening it from outside. "It's over," he said. "You can sit up." She sat up. Leather jacket and his men were on the ground. Zip-tied, she realized. All four of them, wrists behind their backs, managed with the blunt efficiency of a process that had been done many times before. Two of Daniel's men were making calls, walking the perimeter, doing the quiet logistical work of cleaning up a scene. The third was moving her car forward, creating space. Daniel crouched beside her open door, so he was at eye level with her. His jacket was torn at the left shoulder, and there was a cut along his jaw that was bleeding without him appearing to notice it. He was looking at her the way he always looked at her, directly, steadily, but something was different now. The mask was thinner. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No." She looked at her hands, still shaking. "Noah is with your neighbor. I have someone outside your building." He held her gaze. "He's safe, Emily, I promise." She stared at him for a long moment. The cold night air was moving through the space where her window had been. Somewhere a block away, a siren was starting up, getting closer. "Tell me," she said, "right now. All of it." He didn't look away. He didn't reach for the pause he'd used before, the careful not yet. Something had shifted in the geometry of the situation, and they both felt it. The point past which deflection becomes its own kind of cruelty. "My name isn't Daniel Reed," he said. "That's not a name I was born with." She waited. "My name is Dominic Rayleigh." He said it the way people say things they've been keeping inside a locked room for a long time, not with relief exactly, but with the specific gravity of a truth that has weight. 7 months ago, I ran the largest organized network in the Midwest. 3 cities, 14 operations, 60 people answering directly to me. The siren was getting louder. One of his men said something in a low voice, and Daniel, Dominic, held up a hand without looking. 6 months ago, he continued, my second-in-command made a deal with the Vega Syndicate. He gave them our operational structure, our finances, our locations. In exchange, he was supposed to inherit what was left after they dismantled us. A pause. I found out 48 hours before it happened. I had time to disappear. Most of my people didn't. Emily said nothing. The grocery bags were still on the back seat. Milk, bread, eggs, the cereal Noah liked. The absurd normality of it made her feel briefly untethered. I've been hiding, rebuilding quietly, trying to get enough ground back under me to deal with the Vega crew before surfacing. His jaw tightened. And then you walked into a diner and stood up for a stranger, and they saw your face, and I couldn't... He stopped. You couldn't what? She said. I couldn't let it follow you. He said it simply, flatly, like it wasn't complicated, even though everything about it was. The siren reached the end of the block. His men were moving with new efficiency, clearing the scene, guiding the zip-tied men toward a van that had appeared from somewhere. Dominic stood. He was tall in the dark, the cut on his jaw still bleeding. The torn jacket, and she thought, with the strange clarity that extreme stress sometimes produces, that this was probably the most honest she'd ever seen him look. I'm sorry, he said, for all of it, for letting it get here. Emily looked at him for a long time. That's not enough, she said quietly. He nodded. I know. And somewhere in the space between what he was and what he'd done, and the cut on his jaw and her son safe upstairs with Mrs. Petrov, Emily felt the ground she'd been standing on shift permanently. Nothing was going back to before. She already knew that. The question now was what came next. She didn't sleep. She lay in the dark beside Noah, who had come home from Mrs. Petrov's already half asleep, and asked no questions. And she stared at the ceiling while the city made its night sounds outside, and her mind turned over everything Dominic Rayleigh had told her with the relentless, grinding motion of something that couldn't stop itself. 14 operations, 60 people, the largest organized network in the Midwest. She'd brought him coffee. She'd let him walk her to the bus stop. She'd stood in a diner and put herself between him and 3 men who, she now understood, were the least dangerous people in the entire situation. The cut on his jaw. The torn jacket. I couldn't let it follow you. She pressed her palms flat against her eyes until she saw light. He was outside the building when she came down at 7 a.m. Not hiding. Standing at the bottom of the steps in the thin morning light, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the street with the permanent vigilance she now understood as something he'd been born into rather than developed. He turned when he heard the door open. She had Noah's hand in hers. She stopped on the second step, so she was closer to eye level with him, which felt important. I need you to listen to me, she said. Her voice was controlled. She'd been practicing the control since approximately 3 a.m. What you told me last night, I'm not processing it the way you might expect. I'm not going to fall apart, but I need you to hear what I'm saying. Okay, he said. Stay away from us. Something moved in his expression, not surprise, more like a door he'd been braced against, finally pushing open. Emily, I mean it. Her voice stayed level, but underneath it was the particular steel of someone who has been frightened for a week straight and has converted all of it into resolve. You brought this to my door. To my son's school. To my job, my home, my neighbor's door. You made choices that put Noah in the middle of something he has absolutely nothing to do with. And I understand you didn't intend it, and I understand you've been trying to manage it, but the managing hasn't worked. She paused, held his gaze. Every time you get closer to us, the danger gets closer to us. So the answer is distance, your distance. Dominic looked at her for a long moment, then at Noah, who was watching him with the open, unself-conscious curiosity of a child who doesn't yet know to pretend he isn't looking. Hey, buddy, Noah said. Dominic's expression did something complicated and brief. Hey, are you coming to breakfast? No, Emily said firmly. He's not. She squeezed Noah's hand and started down the last step. Don't be here when I get back, she said to Dominic without looking at him. She felt his eyes on her back until she turned the corner. She meant what she'd said. She also knew, with the tired pragmatism of someone who had run out of room for self-deception, that meaning it and being safe were not the same thing. She filed a police report about the previous night's incident, describing the men and the vehicle blockade without mentioning Dominic at all. The officer who took her statement was professional and carefully unencouraging. We'll look into it. These things take time. Make sure your doors are locked. And she drove home afterward, feeling precisely as unsupported as she'd expected to feel. She picked up Noah from school herself. She cooked dinner. She helped him with his reading homework and watched 20 minutes of television and got him into bed by 8:30. She was washing the last of the dishes when someone knocked on her door. She dried her hands, looked at the time, 9:47 p.m., checked the peephole. The hallway was empty. She stood very still, knocked again, 4 times, measured. And then something that wasn't a knock at all, more of a pressure, the door moving slightly in its frame, testing the resistance of the deadbolt and the chain, and Emily was already backing away from it, already moving toward Noah's room, already reaching for her phone. The lights went out. Not a power cut. She heard nothing trip, no building-wide dimming. Just her unit, surgical and specific, and in the sudden dark, she couldn't find the phone she'd been reaching for, and the door was opening in a way doors don't open when locks are working correctly. She screamed, not for help. She screamed Noah's name because her whole body knew the thing it most needed to protect before she'd consciously formed the thought. She heard him startle awake in the next room, heard his voice, small and confused, and saying, "Mom?" And she was in his doorway when the hands found her. Two men, practiced, efficient, the same geometry as everything else this week. One for her arms, one to manage space and motion, a cloth pressed briefly over her face that smelled sharp and chemical, and sent the world tilting sideways in a way that wasn't quite unconsciousness, but was enough. She heard Noah. She heard him clearly, and then she heard him fading, and she fought with everything she had against the tilting darkness and the hands holding her still. And the last thing her mind produced before it went quiet was not fear. It was fury. Dominic knew within 4 minutes. His man outside had seen the vehicle. A plain white panel van, building maintenance markings on the side, the kind of vehicle nobody looked at, and the power disruption, and had called it in before the van's doors were fully closed. Dominic was already moving before the call ended. He called a number and said one word, "Now." What followed was not subtle. He had spent 6 months being careful, strategic, measured, dismantling quietly, rebuilding quietly, staying below the threshold of visibility, while the Vega crew hunted him. He had made calculations, accepted limitations, prioritized concealment over resolution. That was over. 3 locations moved simultaneously at 10:08 p.m., the Vega crew's staging warehouse in the River District. 8 men, 1 point of entry, contained in 4 minutes. A secondary communications hub in Logan Square. 2 men, a server rack, neutralized and burned. A safe house in Bridgeport, where 2 of the zip-tied men from the previous night had been traced. Cleared by 10:19. It wasn't surgical. It was designed not to be. Dominic wanted them to feel it. Wanted every Vega soldier in Chicago to know simultaneously that the equilibrium had broken and what was on the other side of it. His phone rang constantly. He answered selectively. Operations leads, location confirmations, one call from a man he hadn't spoken to in 6 months, whose voice told him that the betrayal inside his own organization was finally, irreversibly being settled tonight as well. He drove through the city with 2 cars behind him and his eyes forward and the image of Noah's doorway in his mind. Emily in it, fighting, refusing even at the last moment to stop fighting. And something he kept, pushed down below all the operational calculation, threatened to surface, and he pushed it down again because there was still work to do. The van had gone east, and his contact had partial plates. 3 possible warehouse locations between their last sighting and the river. He knew which one, without having to reason through it. The one they'd used before, the one his intelligence had flagged 2 days ago, and he'd chosen not to move on, because moving on it would have exposed his position. The irony of that was not lost on him. He pulled up his second phone, sent a single coordinate to his forward team. Move on the river warehouse. Full containment. Nobody leaves before I arrive. Then he called a number he'd been keeping in reserve, a contact so far outside the ordinary mechanics of his operation that using it meant he was fully, visibly, undeniably back. No more waiter named Daniel Reed. No more disappearing into the ordinary machinery of the city. The man answered on the first ring. "I need the river location locked down in 15 minutes, Dominic said, "and I need it quiet on the inside." "There's someone in there you want alive," the man said. Not a question. "Yes," Dominic said. A pause. "That'll cost considerably more than the last time." "I know." He was already turning onto the river road, the city lights fragmenting in the black water beside him. "Bill me." He put the phone down. In the quiet of the car, moving through the dark, he let himself feel it for exactly 3 seconds. The fear, clean and honest, and nothing like the fear he felt for himself, which he'd long since stopped registering. This was different. This was the specific terror of something mattering. 3 seconds. Then he put it away. The warehouse lights appeared at the end of the road. He drove toward them. The warehouse smelled like river water and rust. Emily had been conscious for most of the drive. The chemical cloth hadn't been enough to fully take her under, just enough to make her compliant while they moved her. And by the time they'd zip-tied her wrists to a support beam near the back wall, her head had cleared enough to take inventory. Large space, industrial, high ceiling with skylights that let in weak city glow. 12 men that she could count, maybe more in the sections she couldn't see. 3 separate conversations happening at once in low, urgent voices. The feeling of a place that had been waiting to be used for something specific. She wasn't hurt. That was deliberate. She understood. She wasn't the point. She was the envelope, and whatever message was written inside her was meant for one person. She thought about Noah. She'd heard him calling for her as they'd taken her through the apartment door, and the sound of it had torn something open in her chest that she was holding closed through pure will because falling apart was not available to her right now. Mrs. Petrov's door was directly across the hall. Her neighbor was 71 years old, sharp-eyed, and had survived worse than a power cut in an apartment building. She told herself Noah had run across the hallway. She told herself Mrs. Petrov had opened the door. She told herself he was safe because the alternative was not something she could afford to carry right now. A man sat across from her on an overturned crate, 50s, silver-haired, wearing a suit that had no business being in this building. He had the patient, administrative quality of someone who managed things rather than did them. He'd been watching her since they'd arrived with the detached interest of a man waiting for a car he'd ordered to pull up. "You're not frightened enough," he said. "I'm terrified," Emily said. "I'm just not performing it for you." He considered that. Something like amusement crossed his face and vanished. "He'll come," the man said, more to himself than her. "He always comes for the things he can't afford to lose." He paused. It's the only real weakness a man like Dominic Rayleigh ever had. He thinks he can care about something without it becoming a liability. Emily looked at him steadily. "And what's your weakness?" The man smiled. "I don't have any." "Everyone does," she said. "You just haven't found yours yet tonight." The first sound was nothing. An absence, actually. The 2 guards near the east entrance simply stopped talking in the middle of a sentence, and the silence spread across the warehouse floor the way silence does when the people making noise have been quietly removed from the situation. Silver hair stood up. Then the east wall came open. Not the door, the wall itself, or rather a section of it, pushed inward with force enough that the men nearest to it went sideways before they'd processed what was happening. Through it came 4 men, moving with the clean, terrible efficiency of people who had done this before and had been waiting for the order to stop being patient about it. What followed lasted approximately 90 seconds. Emily pressed her back against the support beam and watched it with her eyes open because closing them felt worse. It was not the way violence looked in films. It was faster, quieter, more functional, over before the mind properly assembled it into sequence. Men went down, weapons were controlled, commands were issued in short syllables that cut through the noise. Silver Hair produced a gun from inside his jacket. He pointed it at Emily. Far enough, he said. Everything stopped. Dominic walked through the cleared space until he was 10 feet from Silver Hair, hands visible, unhurried, and Emily saw his eyes find her first. A full half-second inventory, checking, confirming, before they moved to the man with the gun. "It's done, Carver," he said quietly. "Not yet," Silver Hair Carver said. "Your network is gone. All 3 locations, the last hour. Your communications are cut. The men you have left in this city are either with my people right now or running." Dominic's voice carried the absolute, uninfluenced calm of someone stating the outcome of a game that has already been played. "There's no version of tonight where you walk out of this holding anything. It's just a question of how it ends." Carver's eyes moved to Emily, back to Dominic, reading something there. "She means something to you," he said. "Careful what you do with that information," Dominic said. "It's leverage." "It was leverage," Dominic said, past tense, "because you've already lost everything the leverage was meant to get you. So right now, it's just a choice between 2 outcomes, and I'd rather give you the one you survive." A long moment passed. The warehouse was completely still. 12 men suspended in the held breath of a single decision. Carver lowered the gun. Not quickly, not gracefully, with the slow, grinding reluctance of a man dismantling something he'd built his identity around. 2 of Dominic's men moved forward immediately, controlled and professional, and in 30 seconds, it was over. Dominic crossed the floor to Emily and crouched down, pulling a knife to cut the zip ties from her wrists in 2 clean motions. She stood, unsteady for a moment, and he put a hand briefly on her arm to stabilize her, and then removed it. "Noah," she started, "is with your neighbor. He's fine. I have confirmation." She exhaled, the specific full-body exhale of something releasing that has been held too tightly for too long. Her knees tried to fail, and she stopped them. "You came," she said. "Yes. I told you to stay away." Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite pain. Something in between that had no clean name. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." She looked at him for a long moment in the low industrial light of the warehouse, the sounds of his team working around them, the city humming its indifferent hum beyond the walls. "Is it over?" she asked. "The Vega crew, yes." A pause. "The rest, my organization, the rebuilding, the man who betrayed us, that's being settled tonight as well." He held her gaze. "It won't follow you anymore. I'll make certain of it." "And you?" she said. "What happens to you?" He straightened. "I go back to what I am." His voice was quiet, the same quiet she'd first noticed across a diner counter, except now she knew the depth behind it. "Which means I can't be near you. Being near you was always the danger." She nodded. She'd known that was the answer. Knowing it and feeling it were different things, but she was too tired to pretend otherwise. "Take care of yourself," she said. "You too," he said. "Both of you." Life returned to normal the way it always does after abnormal things. Not all at once, but incrementally, almost insultingly ordinary. The vandalism at Blue Elm was repaired. Her manager called with apologies, and her shifts reinstated. The pressure on her landlord evaporated as quietly and mysteriously as it had arrived, and Mr. Caruso appeared one morning with a brief, awkward apology and no explanation. Noah went back to his regular routine, drawing racing cars, negotiating for chocolate milk, unaware of the war that had moved through the edges of his small world and been deflected before reaching him. Emily went back to Ronnie's diner once, on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks later. A different waiter worked the counter. She had her coffee, tipped generously, and left. The small signs were easy to miss if you weren't looking. The way a threat seemed to resolve before it fully materialized. A difficult situation with her car, towed without warning, and then mysteriously retrieved with the fees paid. A man who followed her from the bus stop one evening and then simply wasn't there the next time she turned around. Noah's school reporting, improved security infrastructure donated anonymously. She noticed all of it. She noticed the black SUV too. Not every day, but enough. Different plates each time, same make and color, same position near the east entrance of the building, same disappearance before she could approach. She stopped pretending she hadn't noticed. One evening in December, 3 months after the warehouse, she stood at her bedroom window with a cup of tea and looked down at the street below. Noah was asleep. The building was quiet. Snow was moving through the amber light of the street lamps in slow, unhurried diagonals. Across the street, just at the edge of the light, a figure stood. Still, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the building with the permanent, patient vigilance of someone who had appointed himself to a post no one had officially given him. She couldn't see his face from this distance. She didn't need to. She raised her hand. Not a wave exactly, something smaller. An acknowledgement. The specific gesture of someone saying, "I see you," to someone who has been trying very hard not to be seen. The figure was still for a moment. Then it turned and walked slowly into the dark. And disappeared. She stood at the window a while longer, tea warm in both hands, watching the empty street where he'd been, and let herself feel the full, complicated truth of it. The anger still present, the fear receding, something else underneath both that she wasn't ready to name. She pulled the curtain closed. Checked on Noah, asleep, arm thrown over his dinosaur book, one sock half off, perfectly safe. She turned off the kitchen light, the hallway light, the lamp on her nightstand. In the dark, she listened to the city outside, ordinary and indifferent and ongoing, and thought about a man standing in the snow at the edge of a streetlight, guarding something he'd decided he had no right to ask for. She thought about it for a long time. Then she closed her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, she slept.